bit of a jump. That's normal. Don't be embarrassed if you squeal.
Did you know you don't have a torch on your head?
It's alright, I have mine in my pocket.
No worries.
It's all good. I used mine as a pointer, but thank you.
Right.
There are times that I forget and I assume it's in my pocket still and it's not, so thank you. I'll count down from 3. So 3, 2, 1. What I'm going to get everyone to do now, just to prove that I do have it in my pocket. There we go. I want everyone to turn their cap around, go up to the top, push that once.
Just get your feet wet. I need to get new shoes anyway.
Mainly because that's the relatively driest side of the tunnel. Marginally. Just let me know if my forehead starts bleeding. My nails are really long. Alright, so you are now standing 61 metres directly underneath that big white poppet head. So this is the same mine shaft that I showed you up on the surface. The only difference is you're looking at it from 61 metres deep underground now. Now what you can't tell on the surface is the mine shaft actually has 4 sections. 1, 2, 3, 4. The centre 2 sections are called the winding or the haulage compartments. So this is where the cages would go up and down to the different levels, carrying the miners and their equipment to where they were needed. That side over there, that's the smoke box. That worked like a chimney. It drew out all of the smoke and the fumes and the dust from the blasting that the miners did. And this side is the ladderway. Now back in the 1940s when this was a working gold mine, that ladderway was the one and only emergency exit. So if these cages stopped working for some reason, that was your only way out at the end of your shift. The ladders do go from the surface right down to the bottom of the mine shaft. Remember, this is a 422 metre deep mine shaft. So if you were one of the lucky miners working on level 17, the lowest level of this mine, and the cages stopped working, you had to climb your way out. And the climb from the bottom of the shaft took you 2.5 hours upwards. Now, I have climbed down from the surface to this level. That's 60. Really long compared to the people I went down with. Okay, it took me about 25, nearly 30 minutes. I went down with the mine maintenance crew and they were down in half of that time.
You having fun?
Mm-hmm. Now, the miners who worked here at the Central Deborah Gold Mine back in the 1940s worked an 8-hour shift underground. They had half an hour for lunch during that time. Now, do you think they got to eat their lunches back up on the surface, or do you think they had to stay deep underground? Deep underground.
Given the amount of time it took, I'd say underground.
Underground.
Mm-hmm.
Mainly because, even though the cages were quite fast, they only carried 4 miners at a time. There was about 40 miners working underground every shift. So trying to get all 40 of them back up to the surface using a tiny cage for a half-hour lunch break didn't work. And the idea of staggered lunch breaks was not a thing back in the 1940s. Now, that meant they stayed underground. But they did dig themselves out a nice little room to eat their lunches in, and that's what you're now sitting in. This was their lunch room, or their crib room. Crib is an old Cornish term, and it means lunch or a light meal, and many of the miners who came here to Bendigo came from Cornwall over in England. Now, there was also no electricity underground back in the day. Everything before the 1900s here in Bendigo was done using the light of a candle. Now, this little contraption is called a spider. It is the only spider you will get here at the Central Deborah Gold Mine. You won't get the 8-legged creepy crawly types down here. There's nothing for them to eat down here, so they just don't come down. So if you're anything like me and you don't like spiders, you're in luck. No spiders, except for this one. Now, this is called a spider because, like a spider, it sits on a wall. Now, cased between a couple of planks of wood. If you didn't have planks of wood, you would have to chisel a hole into the rock to stick it in there. And that's what would hold a candle. And that's what the miners would work by. Typically the light of 1, maybe 2 candles if they were lucky. It was only ever 1 or 2 candles at a time because the mining company that the miners worked for did not supply the candles. you had to buy your own. And candles weren't cheap. So if you could only afford a handful of candles at a time, you wanted to make sure they lasted for as long as possible. You're going to notice a very large room with the lights on. That is our underground function room, or our birthday party room. It is not historically accurate. We dug that out in the 1990s to have functions underground. My dad's rock band, the Rock and Donkeys, was the very first rock band to play 61 metres underground in Bendigo. Now, if that room over there is not historically accurate, there is something here that is historically accurate, and that is the miner's toilet. It's called the Thunderbox. I'll leave that to your imaginations as to why it's called that. Now, it was the job of the youngest miner, the apprentice, to take that bucket up at the end of every shift. Now, when I have kids on the tour, I usually go, it's your job, you can carry it up. And I know, but I usually tell them this though. At the end of your shift, you're a really, really smelly miner. And you're crammed in those cages with 3 other very smelly miners. And you've got to spend, granted, it's a little bit longer going upwards than it is dropping down. So maybe 30 to 40 seconds in a tiny cage with 3 other very smelly miners. There was only one time that one miner got to ride that cage by themselves, and it was the apprentice with the toilet bucket. So yeah, it smelled, but you got to spread out. Yeah. But if there was a sudden stop and it didn't have a lid, yeah, no. Where's my rock? Where's my rock? Where's my other rock? Where's my other rock? So I'm going to teach you all a little bit of mine maintenance now. So whenever the miners needed to test the rock that they were working under to make sure it was safe and solid and not going to fall down on top of them, they would use a technique that they called the sounding of the backs. Now the back is a mining term, and it just means the ceiling of the tunnel. This is the back of the tunnel. Now to sound the backs, to test the rock, the miners grabbed a metal bar and they tapped the rock like this. Not standing back because this goes everywhere. Now they were listening for the noise that it made. That noise, that's a good noise. It's nice and solid. So that means that rock is not going to fall down anytime soon. But every now and then the miners would hear a completely different noise. They would hear this one instead. Hear the difference? Yeah, that hollow noise is not a good noise. It's called a drummy sound. And let the miners know that that rock right there, that's loose. That could fall off and do some damage. So whenever they heard that drummy sound, they did one of 2 things. They either grabbed a pinch bar and they tried to remove that loose rock by either prizing it off or scraping it away. That's called scaling or barring down. But if it's too dangerous to do that, if they thought far too much rock was going to fall down on top of them, what they'd do instead is they would build a timber set. Now, if you're wondering where all of the wood from the trees went to building these underground, every mine had one, because this is what they would build to stop any rocks from falling on top of them. This is a timber set. The most important part of a timber set are the logs on top. They're called lagging. Now, there was a nickname for this structure. It was also called the talking timbers. It was, in a sense, an early warning system. So if they heard any scatterings of rocks on the logs on top or creaking from the pressure of impending rockfall, they knew to get out of the area. Now, another thing about this structure right here is that it's not an original timber set. Remember how I said we came through here and made the tunnels bigger for big groups? Well, when we did that, we had to take down all the old timber sets because they were rotting through. And when the wood starts to rot, it's not doing its job anymore. It's protecting no one. So we took them down, we made the tunnels bigger, and we rebuilt the timber sets. Now, we tried to build these using the same techniques that the miners did back in the day, but we have safety boxes we have to tick today. Miners didn't have those same safety boxes back in the 1940s. So we used things that the miners never used. We used nails and nuts and bolts. The miners wouldn't use anything that could rust, so all the wooden structures were built using timbering and joinery skills. So if this one here is not an original timber set, it's not actually made using the wood from Bendigo. The trees in Bendigo, the iron bark trees that they used back in the day, well, they are now considered an endangered species in the area. We've tried to repopulate the iron bark tree population, but it's slow going. There are about 7 of the original iron bark trees from before mining days here in Bendigo still around. 7 of them. Most of them are in the suburb of Ironbark, which is it's lovely, named the suburb after them. But they were highly protected. So when we built these timber sets back in the 80s, we had to source all of this wood from outside of Bendigo. Is tiny compared to those on the lower levels of this mine. Some of those were meters tall. The further underground you went, the taller the quartz reef got. More quartz there is, the more likely you are to find gold. But we're actually really lucky in this reef. Boom, 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 and the hole would get bigger and bigger and bigger as most of the rock stayed here. Very occasionally you have small bits flying out. But it was safe enough to use while the miners were still underground. Now I'm going to show you the sequence that this went off in by pushing a button. Now when I push this button, nothing is actually going to explode. It is just a light and sound show. There are flashing lights, so if you have an aversion to flashing lights, let me know. No, everyone's okay with flashing lights? That's okay. Now, this was set up by Ken, my mentor, who was a demolitions expert. It was his job to teach other miners how to set the explosives. So this is timed fairly accurately. And to get the best effect, what I'm going to ask is everyone okay with turning your cap lamps off?
Yep.
Yeah? Turn them off. You're going to see just how dark it is down underground as well. There are 3 settings. I should have warned them. I keep on forgetting that I'm the only person who knows that. All right. Okay. 3, 2, 1. And you may turn the cap lamps back on. At the end of that, you have a gigantic hole, or depending on how big the hole is, of course. And a lot of rock, and I'm going to talk about how they got that rock up to the surface in just a moment. Before I do that, I'm going to show you the explosives that they used. So they used sticks of gelignite. They put about 3 or 4 of these into each of the holes. The one at the end had the detonation cord, or blasting cord. Hang on, let me just get that one there. There we are. I need more hands. So you put that end in like that, and you'd fray the other end, you'd light it, and basically worked like a fuse. There were some mines that had detonators and fuse wires, but this one they used blasting cords instead. Essentially the same thing. Now lighting the frayed end of the blasting cord was the last thing that the miners did at the end of their shift. They lit the cords, made their way very calmly back to the cages, where they waited to go home at the end of their shift. But they were underground while everything went kaboom, because they had to count all the booms. In our case, there were 12 booms, and I counted each and every time, even though it's a recording, and I know it's never going to change. Because if this was for real, and we only heard 11 booms, it meant that there could be some unexploded sticks of gelignite amongst all of that rock. So we then had to tell the next crew that were coming down to dig out the rock to be very careful. They'd have to find those sticks of gelignite before they did anything. Because if they didn't, you wouldn't really want to see the results. Now with me here I have 2 different tools that the miners who work the different mines in Bendigo, so not just this one, the 2 different tools that they might have used to dig up the rock whilst underground and fill up the mine trucks. I have this absolutely amazing machine behind me, the rocker shovel, and I have an actual shovel. Now remembering that this was not a very successful gold mine, they didn't have a lot of money to spend on fancy equipment. Which tool do you think the poor miners here had to use? They had to do everything the hard way. Now using a shovel, it took a miner about 12 minutes to fill up that truck right to the top. When it was full, it weighed half a ton. You then had to push that back to the mine shaft where it went up to the surface and all that rock was sorted. If it was grey, it was chucked over the side onto the waste rock pile, that mullock heap. But if it was white, if it was quartz, it was taken off-site to a stamping battery where it was crushed to release the gold. When the truck was empty, once all the rock was sorted, it was brought back down here, you pushed it back here, you filled it up again, you pushed it back to the mine shaft, it went back up to the surface, it was sorted, came back down here, you pushed it back here, there and back, there and back. 30 to 35 times a shift. Miners were really, really, really fit. Did not need to go to the gym after work. Now in those lucky mines, especially after the late 20s when it was invented, making lots of money, they might have had one of these, a rocker shovel. Using a rocker shovel, it took a miner about 3 minutes, if that, to fill up that truck. And you weren't getting really tired constantly digging out the rock because the machine did it for you. So your miners were more productive as well. Now, unfortunately, I can't switch this machine on at the moment because it's currently broken. When things break down here at the Central Deborah Gold Mine, it's not an easy fix. They don't make machines like this anymore. You've got newer types on the market, but they use different parts. So we can't just go on eBay and buy a new part. We need to find someone who can make a part from scratch. Then we've got to fit it, then we've got to test it. It takes a long time to get things back up and running. But it is really quite simple to use. You've got 2 levers. This one controls the rocker shovel forwards and backwards along the track, and this one controls the bucket to scoop the rock up over into the mine truck and back down again. So it's going forwards, scooping the rock, backwards, down the rock, and you just walk along with it. Much, much easier to use. So that's the very last thing I have to show you underground. We're about to head down that way. It came down in. Before we do that though, any questions?
Oh my gosh!